Well, good morning, guys. As you have probably heard, I do have COVID. Thankfully, I do have very, very mild symptoms. I had a bit of a fever last night and didn't sleep very well, a bit of a stuffy nose. Thankfully, some ibuprofen took care of the fever, and a couple naps took care of the lack of sleep. So I'm doing great. I can't come in, unfortunately. I'll be in just as soon as I can. And in the meantime, enjoy your video classes. So we're going to be talking today about, Middle Ages, but what life was like in the small villages that they had. And life in the Middle Ages really did center around the manor, which was a type of small village. It wasn't city life, it wasn't country life, it was something in between. The manor was not exactly a town or a village organized the way that you and I would think of today. It was a self-contained, meaning everything you needed was made right there. You didn't really need to go outside the manor for much. Self-contained farming community. Speaking of self-contained, what's the number one resource people need is food. So the whole community centered around making food, farming, fishing, maybe if you're on a big river or coastline. Hunting, although usually poor people did not hunt, that would be the rich people's job because it's fun. So only rich people get to hunt. Um, Farming, raising cattle, raising sheep, that kind of thing. Self-contained farming community owned by the Lord. The Lord owns all the property. Everyone who lives in the manor is bound to the Lord. They work for the Lord. They rent from the Lord. The Lord gets to make all the decisions. The Lord is a mini dictator. In his manor, the Lord is 100% in charge, and they can make whatever rules they want. They are not bound by many laws at all. They get to make all the decisions. It's owned by the Lord, but of course all the work is done by the peasants, and the vast majority of people would be peasants. Your manor might have 300 or 400 people in it, and of those, one person is a lord, and everyone else is peasants. Well, you might have a handful of free men, but the vast majority of those are peasants. Here's a quaint little picture. I do love this guy. I forget who this guy is, this artist, but he has written some really amazing books describing the past. So here is probably a really small manor. They don't really have a castle. What they have is the manor house. So this is probably a very minor nobleman, maybe even not a earl or anything. Maybe it's just a knight. They do have the nicest house in the village. It's 3 stories. Wow, amazing. Probably pretty defensible with a thick door in it, but really not meant for defense. It's just the guy's house. Um, then you have a church, and sometimes the church was the biggest, most expensive building in town. Every town had its own church, and the church had a lot of authority everywhere you go. So here you see a nice big stone church and a kind of smallish wooden manor house. Interesting. You have a forest. That forest would be very useful for wood for building materials, but also firewood. That is really the only source of fuel and heat in the winter is firewood. An interesting phrase from the Middle Ages was by hook or by crook. And that meant that you're allowed to collect any wood that you can collect with a hook, which is like a stick with a hook on it, or a crook, which means like a crooked stick. Any dead wood you can knock off the branches or you can pick up from the ground, that's yours. Any live trees belong to the nobleman, and you're not allowed to take them. But any windfalls. By the way, that is where windfall comes from. The phrase windfall today means an unexpected surprise of money or something, an unexpected good thing happening to you, unexpected resource, and that literally was back from the day. If you're very cold and in the winter and you don't have much firewood left, you can go out there and wow, the wind knocked over a tree and I get to harvest this tree and take it home. Now I have plenty of firewood in this windfall. Anyway, you have 2 fields. They did a 2 or a 3 crop system. Started with 2, later in the Middle Ages, a 3 crop system. And the 2 crop system was very basic. One field is fallow, which means it's empty, and the other field is planted. It has plants in it. The idea of leaving one of your fields fallow or empty was so that the animals there can replenish the nutrients. You know what I mean? Plants take nutrients out, animals put the nutrients in. So you might keep your sheep and cows in the fallow field for a year or two. They developed a 3 field system later on in the Middle Ages when they actually found that different types of plants take different nutrients from the soil and give back different nutrients in the soil. So you can actually have different types of crops. And that's something that George Washington Carver figured out, that peanuts give nitrogen into the soil and cotton takes so much nitrogen out of the soil. So if you rotate peanuts and cotton, you actually get way more cotton than if you just did cotton every year. In fact, if I remember correctly, by the fourth year in a row planting just cotton, you only got 10% of the cotton you got the first year. It went like 100% of cotton the first year. The second year was like 70, then 30, then like 10%, because it needs so much nitrogen, and peanuts give nitrogen back. So they figured out how to use their fields much more efficiently, um, with 3 fields, 2 of them active at a time, and just one of them kind of wasted. Other things you need. The blacksmith makes pretty much all the tools needed for the entire village. You do not have Home Depot or Lowe's. You got the local blacksmith makes whatever you need. Every town's going to need a blacksmith. If you don't have a blacksmith, you are in trouble. Maybe if you're really close by to another town and they have a blacksmith, you can walk back and forth, but you really need a blacksmith. Priest has his own house, parsonage type thing. Most of these are just people's houses. Notice there's a little garden here. So the field would be for like grains and stuff. Garden is for vegetables and things. But then look at this, the Lord's oven. There were very specific rules about baking bread. Most houses would not have had an oven in it. Because it's dangerous. The whole village is made out of straw and wood. The roofs are all made out of straw. You're not allowed to have an oven just anywhere. But the Lord would have these mega ovens. When I say oven, think of a pizza brick oven. Really, really big, made out of bricks, probably fire underneath, and then like a brick floor ceiling, and then all the bread goes in there. So you bring your bread to the Lord's oven, and you have to pay the Lord in bread. They get some of your bread every time. Anything else here? Here's some archery practice going on. This is highly inaccurate. Can you spot what is wrong with this picture? That's right. Why are they shooting towards the village? What happens about a stray arrow? You miss the target and you hit the gardener. That's really, really stupid. Why don't you put the targets this way and shoot towards the woods? Always check your target, guys, and check what's beyond your target. When I took hunter safety courses in Vermont when I was a teenager, this guy took a clipping from the newspaper way back in the day when we had newspapers. And one of the weeks I was taking hunter safety, there was a guy shooting a gun in his backyard, and he missed his target. And that bullet flew 1.5 miles and hit some lady on a rocking chair. So know where your bullets are going if you miss your target, okay? Check downrange. This is really not a clever idea. What was really common is having the target set up against a hill. So if you miss, it goes right into the dirt there, and you can go collect your arrows rather than having to run and get them. So the point of the manor is that it is self-contained. Everything you need is right there. Something that wasn't in that picture was a mill for your grain. That would be a very necessary job, is to grind all that grain. You could have hand mills, but that's going to take so much of your time. The village would want a great big mill, either run by wind power or water power or animal power. Get an ox or something to walk around in circles, because everything you need is right there in your village, in your manor. There's very little trade except for a handful of niche items that can't really be made. Very little trade. Everyone's staying where you are. And there aren't very many towns like what you and I would think of, where you have thousands of people living together on their own. No, it's really the manor. By the way, the growth of towns is going to destroy feudalism, because towns are outside of the Lord's control. Because everything is done on such a small scale, there wasn't really much use for coins. They did definitely have coins, but pretty much the only person using money would often be the Lord, especially in a smaller manner. It's completely done on the barter system. Even all your taxes and your rent money, that's all paid for in kind, which means you're paying for it in bacon and in salt pork and in wheat and flour and just in work. You'd have to work for the Lord for a couple days out of the week. And it's all done on the barter system, not really um, buying stuff and selling stuff. By the way, not only was the manor self-enclosed, but pretty much every family was greatly self-enclosed. There often would not be a weaver or a tailor or a seamstress in your town because mom makes your family's clothes. You shear your own sheep, you spin your own wool, you weave your own clothes. That's done at home. So really not a huge need to buy a lot of stuff. So not a huge need for coins, except for on big purchases like, the Lord buys 10,000 cattle from his neighbor. He's going to need coins for that. Each manor would have its own priest, very important, and they would have their own skilled workers for whatever skills are necessary. Of course, in the smaller manors, you might have, a butcher, although, dad might just butcher all the animals. In a bigger town, you'd probably want more butchers. In a bigger town, you probably do have tailors and weavers and things like that. You might have a carpenter. In the smaller towns, dad puts together a cabin as best as he can. In the bigger towns, you might have a few carpenters who know how to use the wood and make stuff. The smaller towns, you're sitting on a tree stump. That's your chair. In the bigger towns, you might have a carpenter who knows how to make chairs. That kind of thing. You might have a stonemason. Stonemasons were paid very, very well to oversee the work of building stone walls and building castles. It's very difficult work. The guy in charge would be paid a lot, but then the vast majority of work would be given to the peasants to move the stones here and there. There were a few trade goods that would be traded even from country to country far away, and that includes things like salt. If you're on the ocean, you make your own salt. If you are in an area with salt mine, you mine your own salt. But there's some places inland that don't have their own salt that might need to buy it from hundreds of miles away. Iron too. A lot of manors were situated on some kind of natural resource. So you might be situated up against the woods and you sell lumber outside of your manor. You might be, on a stream and you sell fish to the manor next door down the road a few miles. You might have your manor on an iron mine or a silver mine or a gold mine, and then that stuff can be exported to the next manor over. Iron would be very important for all the tools, all the weapons would be made out of iron. So you need iron, and the iron mining manors would sell those miles and miles and miles away. Then tar. Tar is used as a waterproofer for many, many different applications. Um, One method of making tar is cooking pine wood in a very low oxygen environment, and it burns away the carbon, and the sap kind of comes out and melts into tar. The manor would have usually a pretty small village, a couple hundred people living there, and the huts would be wattle and daub, which means you have these big posts, and then in between the posts you make almost like weaving sticks together, and that's called the wattle. And then over those sticks you smear mud, and that's called the daub, and that's your plaster. They had special types of mud recipes that they would make it last long. Um, they would sometimes put egg whites in it to act as a binder. They would sometimes put manure in it also to make it stickier. Lovely. Yeah. And then, of course, they would whitewash the outside, just get a bit of limestone and some water and I don't know what else. And that makes a very cheap white paint called whitewash, and that helps it be waterproof and take away the stink. Of course, these buildings are very not very durable, but they're very easy to repair. To repair it, you grab a couple sticks and a handful of mud, and there you go. The roofs would be made out of thatch, which just means hay or straw, really. When you harvest the wheat, the wheat grows on the top a little bit, and then you have like 4 feet or something of just useless stock, and that has no nutritional value. So like the cows aren't really gonna eat it. So you can use that as bedding for the animals, and then you could use it as a roof over your heads, and they would just take these huge sections of thatch and huge bundles and throw it up there. Thatching your roof might be 2 feet thick or more, and it would be very good insulator, very efficient waterproofer when it's that big. But a couple of major drawbacks. Number one, if it gets rainy, it will rot, and you will have to replace it. It can burn very easily if it's in a dry season. Any little spark is gonna, your house goes up in flames in an instant. And then, of course, burning straw lets off a lot more sparks, and that's gonna burn the house next to you, and that's a major problem. Um, Animals like making nests in there, so you might have some rats and cats and dogs and bears and snakes and who knows what is all living in your roof. That's gross. Two largest buildings are going to be the castle or manor house and the church. Here's a artist rendition. Little palisade wall here. Looks like there's some stables here. Looks like these might be like the Lord's house, not a villager's house. So the villagers live down here somewhere and might have to run behind the wall. Here's a Mott and Bailey castle where you do have this tiny little fort here. You're not meant to live in that fort. It's tiny. You just run there for a last-ditch defense. This little roundhouse might be a buttery. They would make these stone houses, little round stone houses, and they would dig them out so they'd be like several feet deep into the ground, and it would keep them nice and cool, and they'd keep their milk and butter and other perishable items in there like a low-tech refrigerator. I wonder if that's what that is. Interesting. 1/6 of all the arable land, that means all the farmland, was the Lord's demesne, which means the land that goes directly to him. All the land is owned by the Lord, but the food grown on 1/6 of the land goes directly to the Lord, and that would be these red stripes here. And do notice that this is the 3-field system where you have one field is fallow, nothing going on there. Here is one field that is planting spring crops that need one type of nutrition from the soil. Here's another one that's planting fall crops that needs another type of nutrition from the soil. There are some crops that you plant in the spring and it immediately sprouts and grows. There's other crops that you plant in the fall and it waits all winter long and then sprouts first thing in the spring. Depending on where you are in Europe, Southern Europe, there are some places with a mild enough climate and long enough days, long enough growing season that you could plant one crop in the spring, harvest that, and immediately plant another thing and harvest something else in the fall. That's pretty cool. You have a meadow, we have the barn where all the animals live, you have a blacksmith, the manor house, the bakery, a bunch of houses here and houses here, church. You have the water mill. Here's all your grain is ground there with a water wheel. You have orchards of fruit trees here, and then just wild forests. Common pastures here. They didn't really have like fenced off pastures. They just had the village's animals would all live in the same barn, and they would go eat the same grass in the pasture. Sometimes they would hire or assign a couple of the village teenagers to watch the animals. And then just take turns, different families watching the animals on different days, making sure no wolves get them or anything. The concept of the village green, we still have like village parks kind of, but they would have a village green, and that's just common land where all the village's cows come to eat. Already talked about the 2 versus 3 field system. The majority of the people are serfs, also known as peasants, have no rights at all, no say in government. Another word was villain. It's kind of like villain, and in fact, villain, meaning a bad guy, does come from the word villain, which means a poor person, because of course, poor people are the bad guys, right? That's literally where the word villain comes from. Interesting outfits here. Did you know that medieval Europeans were super into hoodies? Makes sense. They didn't have the nice warm clothing like we do today. So what they would do is they would layer, and they would have multiple layers on, but then you'd have to cover your head. They didn't have balaclavas or ski masks or anything, and they would be working out there in the field in all manner of weather. And it might be cold out there, but you don't have a tractor harvesting your food. You got to go out there, work by hand, manual labor in bad weather conditions. It's very difficult. So they would wear tights. Definitely, if you're wearing a skirt, it's cold out there, so you got to wear pants underneath it. A tunic is the main style of clothing, which is a one-piece garment that is like a shirt and a skirt put together, sometimes with short sleeves or long sleeves, like shown here. Sometimes no sleeves at all. It's just the shirt going down to the skirt, and then a belt in the middle to kind of cinch it up. Um, Here's their hoodies, detachable hoods, so that if it's hot, you could take it off. If it's cold, you could put it on. If it's really cold, you could put on two. A detachable hoodie would be called a coif. Here is another style with this really weird, this is just for decoration. Have you ever seen this kind of snaky thing coming out of the back of someone's head? That's called a lyra pipe. And people got really into that. And notice they are carrying their grain by tying it with a rope and then carrying the rope. That's it's interesting. Moccasin style, soft leather shoes. They don't have really like hard soles like we do today. They're soft coverings, probably leather to make it more waterproof. Serf, it's not just a job, it's an indenture. Yeah, you are bound to your lord, usually not allowed to leave the manor, usually have no rights, usually have to work very hard for the lord. A handful of people in the manor would be freemen, which means that they are working for pay. They're not practical slaves that the serfs were. They would typically be from a better family, have more political connections, or have some very good skill. The priests, they're from the powerful church. They're all free men. They're not serfs. They're not peasants. The blacksmiths, they know what they're doing. The masons, they know what they're doing. They're all free men. They're allowed to go where they want, trying to get a better price for their work. There's some kind of foreman making the people harvest. I have a priest or two. There you go. They really loved having their days off. Now, they worked incredibly hard, and they would do 6-day work weeks. They work from sun up to sundown, Monday through Saturday. They would have Sunday off, but then they would also have a lot of holidays, way more than we do today. And they'd have two huge, several week-long celebrations. Those would be Christmas and Easter, celebrating Jesus' coming, then celebrating his victory over death. Lots and lots of minor holidays, often the birthdays of various saints would be a day off of work. They didn't have a lot of, in fact, I don't know if they had any patriotic holidays. Think about the patriotic holidays that we have. We have the 4th of July, we have Veterans Day and Memorial Day. We have, what are other, Mexico has Cinco de Mayo. Bastille Day in France. Lots of countries have political holidays. Um, President's Day is a political holiday. It's halfway between Washington's and Lincoln's birthday, kind of celebrating those two. Flag Day. Sometimes people take that day off. They didn't really do politics back then. They didn't have national politics. They had very local politics. There's no one, so they didn't have political holidays. They had a lot of religious holidays instead. In fact, that's what the word holiday means, holy day. A lot of these would be festivals where you feast and you feast and you feast, 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 feast. Um, Here's a dude making wine. And if you've ever seen the I Love Lucy episode where they make wine, it's hilarious. Or grape juice. Or is it olive oil? I don't remember. You make olive oil the same way you make grape juice, and then later for wine, you put it in a big old bucket and you hop in and squish it with your toes. I think it is grapes they're pressing in I Love Lucy. It's awesome. Go watch that episode. And yeah, you just have this big barrel full and you take your shoes off and hop right in. I don't know if they invented athlete's foot powder by that time, Gold Bond or something, but that sounds kind of gross. I'm glad they don't do it that way anymore. I just had some delicious cranberry juice at Thanksgiving, and I hope that was not pressed out by stinky feet. Here's a dude with a basket full of probably fish. Probably what that is, kind of like an early backpack. Don't know what this guy is doing with that stick. Oh no, they're collecting all sorts of food. Take a look at this guy's haircut. Kind of weird. This guy's hat. A lot of them have silly hats. Yeah, serf's life was very, very hard, really hard work weeks. They often had very, very little food, very little what we would consider necessities, medication. There is no medication. The doctor said, crazy superstitious remedies. Look up some; they're kind of silly, and no way to get out of poverty. Because there's very little in the way of agricultural technology, they don't really have the best harvest ever. And if any one little thing goes wrong, there's not enough food this year. They did not have really good food storage techniques, which means if something goes wrong with a harvest or there's some kind of animal disease or some any little thing goes wrong, they're in big trouble. And starvation was a huge issue in the Middle Ages. In fact, starvation has been a huge issue for most of human history. It is not until very, very modern times that we're like guaranteed to have food on the table. That is something that we really ought to be thankful for. Think about that next time mama makes a meal you don't really like. Like, well, at least I'm not starving. And then wars. People are constantly fighting, and it's not nation against nation, it's nobleman against nobleman. So small scale fighting, but constant. You never know when your neighbor's going to roll up with an army and try to stab you and steal all your horses. And there's no machines. People are more plentiful than animals, so people might be pulling the plows and doing a lot of the manual labor. Then a very poor diet. They did not have the very diet that we are accustomed to, so there would often be vitamin deficiencies. You don't get your fresh fruit and veggies in the winter. You're lucky to get old, hard, stale veggies, dried stuff in the winter. Um, yeah, diet was definitely a problem and led to a lot of health problems. Have you heard of the poem "Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old? Some like it hot, some like it cold, some like it in the pot 9 days old." And that's really because that was one of the most common foods is you just get a kettle full of water and you throw in a handful of whatever food you might have. And it might be peas, it might be a handful of grain, it might be some meat on rare occasions, it might be, just whatever. And you don't have a refrigerator, so leftovers stay in the pot. And then for dinner tomorrow, you just add more water and add more of whatever you got. So yeah, you might very well have peas porridge that's been in the pot 9 days old, and that would not have been strange. It also would not have been healthy. Um, the longer you cook something, the more vitamins break down into their components until you don't have the vitamin anymore. But then also, obviously, the longer food is just sitting out, the more bacteria are going to get into it, and people are going to get sick. They're going to get E. coli, and they're going to die. Not good.